37. What happened when I slept in another room from my Amish husband? The quilt was already on the bed when I arrived. I noticed it the moment my mother-in-law opened the door to what she called the guest room. Though in the 17 years I had been alive, I had never heard of a bride being shown to a guest room on the evening of her wedding. It was folded across the foot of a narrow single bed, pressed flat and precise, its colors muted in the way of something old, ivory and deep blue, with a pattern of interlocking rings stitched so tightly, the seams looked like they had never been meant to come apart. Someone had placed it there deliberately. Someone had made that bed before I arrived. My husband, Eli, was downstairs. I remember standing at the foot of that bed, still wearing my wedding dress, still holding the small bundle my mother had pressed into my hands that morning, and thinking that perhaps I had misunderstood something. Perhaps this was a tradition in Eli's district that no one had mentioned. Perhaps the guest room was temporary. Perhaps in our community, where I had grown up, we simply did not know every rule that existed in his. I told myself all of those things. I was good at telling myself things in those days. What I did not do, what I did not allow myself to do, was look too closely at the quilt. Not yet. Because some part of me already understood that if I looked too closely at it, I would have to ask a question. And in the household I had just entered, I was beginning to sense that questions were not welcome. My name is Sarah. I am 51 years old now. The community where I grew up sat in a wide valley in Pennsylvania, surrounded by farms that had belonged to the same families for 4 and 5 generations. My father was a quiet man who repaired harnesses and believed that silence was a form of prayer. My mother canned everything: peaches, beets, green beans, and lined the jars along the cellar shelf in rows so straight they looked ceremonial. We were not a wealthy family, but we were considered stable, and in our district, stability was the closest thing to happiness that most people openly admitted to wanting. I had known Eli Brubaker for approximately 2 years before our wedding. He was 24 to my 17, which was not unusual. He was considered a good match, industrious, respected by the deacon, a man who owned land already through his father's early gift to him. He did not speak much, but the men in our community rarely did, and I had been taught to interpret silence as depth rather than absence. Our courtship, such as it was, consisted of Sunday meals and a handful of carefully supervised conversations. He was not unkind during that time. He was not warm, precisely, but I did not expect warmth. I expected steadiness, and he offered that. Or he appeared to. We were married on a Thursday in November, the way marriages were always done in our district. I wore a blue dress my mother had sewn over the course of 6 weeks. There was a meal, and hymns, and the deacon read from Ephesians, in a voice that made the words sound final, in a way I had not quite felt them sound before. And then, as evening came, and families began making their way home along the cold road, Eli's mother, Ruth, guided me upstairs in a house I had visited exactly 3 times, and showed me to a room at the end of the hallway. Not the room where Eli slept. "You'll be comfortable here," she said, and she pulled the door closed behind her, and I heard her footsteps moving back down the hallway without pausing, without explaining. That first night, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long time. I could hear the house settling around me, the sound of a fire burning somewhere below, the faint murmur of voices I could not separate into words. Eli's voice was in there somewhere. His father's, his mother's. No one came to check on me. I slept eventually, because the body insists on sleep even when the mind refuses to stop working. And when I woke, pale winter light was coming through a curtain I had not opened, and the quilt was still folded at my feet, exactly as it had been. In the morning, Ruth told me that Eli rose early for farm work, and that I should come down for breakfast at 6. She said this pleasantly, efficiently, the way she explained nearly everything, as though the information were simply practical and carried no other meaning. I came down at 6. Eli was already at the table. He nodded at me the way one nods at a neighbor, not a wife of fewer than 24 hours. He ate. He left. I washed the dishes. Ruth showed me where things were kept, and so the pattern began. I will not pretend that I immediately understood what was happening. The mind resists conclusions that hurt it. Instead, I developed explanations. Perhaps Eli was a private sleeper. Some men were. Perhaps this was temporary, related to the adjustment of a new household. Perhaps, once his mother moved to her own place, and we had the farmhouse to ourselves, things would change. I held those explanations carefully, the way you hold a jar you are not sure is sealed properly. About 3 weeks after the wedding, I finally let myself look at the quilt. I had been refolding it one morning. I made the bed each day out of something between habit and hope, when I noticed that one of the rings in the pattern was unfinished. Not worn away or damaged. Unfinished. The stitching simply stopped midway through the outer edge of one ring, then started again slightly differently, as though someone else had picked up the needle. The thread color was close but not identical. A shade cooler, slightly bluer than the ivory surrounding it. I ran my finger along the break in the seam. It was small enough to miss if you were not looking. I would not have noticed it at all, except that the rings around it were so precisely made that the interruption stood out like a held breath in an otherwise even sentence. I refolded the quilt and placed it back at the foot of the bed. But I thought about that unfinished ring for the rest of the day. Winter passed. Ruth moved to a smaller house on the edge of the property in early spring, which was something Eli had apparently promised her she could do once he married. Her own space, her own quiet. I had imagined that her absence from the main house would change things between Eli and me. More privacy, I thought. More room for whatever a marriage was supposed to grow into. The door between the guest room and the rest of the hallway remained closed every night. Eli was not cruel to me in any obvious way. He fed me, in the sense that food existed in the house and I cooked it. He did not raise his voice. He worked hard and brought money into the household. And in the community where we lived, that was understood to be a husband's primary obligation. We sat at meals. We attended Sunday service. We spoke about practical things. The fence that needed repair. The price of grain. Whether the cellar was staying dry. He never once entered the room where I slept. I asked him about it once. Only once. In those early months. It was May, and we were walking back from evening chores, and the air smelled of mud and new grass, and I felt brave enough to say it quietly, without pressure. I asked if perhaps we might consider sharing a room. He looked at me the way someone looks at a sentence they've already decided not to finish reading. That isn't how things are, he said, and he went inside. In our district, there was no one I felt I could ask. My mother was a woman who had been taught that a wife's confusion about her marriage was a private matter between herself and God. My father would not have known what to do with the question. My closest friend, a girl named Miriam who had grown up 2 farms from mine, had married the previous spring and seemed to inhabit a different universe, one with shared rooms and a husband who laughed at supper. I mentioned it to her once, carefully, without specifics. I said that Eli and I had a somewhat unusual arrangement. She looked at me with an expression I have thought about many times since. Not quite pity, not quite recognition, but something between the two. She said, "Some men are like that, Sarah. It doesn't mean anything's wrong." I went home and stood in the guest room for a few minutes before starting supper. It was on that same evening that I noticed the name. I had been lifting the quilt to shake it out, something I did periodically, because the room felt close, and the fabric trapped the smell of the small space, when I felt something inside the folded edge. Not a lump exactly, more like a slight stiffness at the corner, as though the binding had been doubled over something flat. I sat down and worked the corner apart carefully, following the seam with my thumbnail until the folded edge opened far enough to reveal a small piece of paper. It was folded into quarters, thin with age, the kind of writing paper that came from a tablet rather than a printer. The lines faint, the margins soft. I unfolded it. There was one line of handwriting in the center, a woman's handwriting, small and even. The letters formed with the careful deliberateness of someone who did not often write letters, but took the act seriously when they did. For the room where she will sleep. MB. Nothing else. MB. I sat with the paper in my hands for a very long time. MB were not Ruth's initials. Ruth's maiden name had been Yoder before she became a Brubaker. She had been Ruth Yoder until her wedding day, and since then, Ruth Brubaker. RBMB was a Brubaker. I knew enough of Eli's family to know that his father had one brother, deceased, and that the brother had left behind a wife who had eventually moved away, out of the district, perhaps out of the state. I knew this only because Ruth had mentioned it once, briefly, in the early weeks of my marriage, and then had not mentioned it again. The way she had said it, the speed of it, the slight tightening around her eyes, had given me the impression that the subject was closed. The brother's wife. Her name had not been spoken in front of me. Not once. I refolded the paper and placed it back inside the quilt's binding. But it had already changed. The quilt was no longer simply an object that had been waiting in the room. It had been placed there by someone. Someone with initials. Someone who had known, in advance, that there would be a room. That there would be a woman sleeping in it alone. I began to pay attention differently. There was a cedar chest against the wall of the guest room. I had always assumed it was storage, the kind of thing households accumulate without intention. I had never opened it. In the community where I grew up, a woman did not go through her husband's family's belongings without invitation, but I was no longer thinking of myself as a woman without questions. I opened the chest one afternoon in July, while Eli was in the far field and the house was quiet, except for the sound of a bee working its way along the outside of the window glass. Inside, folded fabric, a child's shoe, just one, a small painted wooden box, and at the bottom, beneath everything else, a marriage certificate. I lifted it carefully, the way you lift something you suspect is fragile. The names on the certificate were Eli Brubaker and Martha Byler. The date was 11 years before our wedding. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I closed the chest. I finished preparing supper. I put plates on the table and food on the plates. When Eli came in from the field, I did not look at him differently. Or rather, I tried not to. I kept my hands steady. I kept my voice level. "How was the East Field?" I asked. "Dry," he said. And we ate in the silence that had always been our silence. Except that now I understood the silence had a room of its own. A chest of its own. A name. Martha. M.B. Martha Byler, before she became a Brubaker. She had made the quilt. She had placed the note inside it. She had slept in that room. Not as a guest, as a wife. And then she had disappeared from the story, the way someone disappears when everyone around them agrees not to say their name. I went to Ruth. I did not go with the certificate. I went with only the note, unfolded, held flat in my hand, and I walked to the small house on the edge of the property on a Tuesday morning, when the light was gray and the air smelled of coming rain. Ruth opened the door and looked at me the way she always looked at me, measuring, careful. She saw the paper. Something in her face changed, though she controlled it quickly. She stepped aside and let me in. I laid the paper on her table. I said, "I found this inside the quilt." She looked at it for a long moment without touching it. "I wondered if that was still there," she said finally. It was not the response I had expected. I had prepared for denial. I had prepared for anger. I had not prepared for the quiet resignation of a woman who had been waiting a long time for a particular conversation to arrive. Ruth sat down. She folded her hands. She told me about Martha. Eli had married Martha Byler when he was 20, and she was 19. Ruth told this with the careful flatness of someone reporting facts rather than memories, though I could hear memory pressing underneath every sentence. Martha had been from a family 2 districts over. The marriage had been considered a good one. In the 2nd year of the marriage, Martha had become pregnant. The child was born early and did not survive. Martha had been ill afterward. Not briefly ill, but the kind of ill that settles in and rearranges a person. She had spent months in the guest room, because the main bedroom, with its window facing the road, gave her headaches she could not manage. And then, Ruth said, Martha had left. Not died. Left. She had gone back to her family in the other district and had not returned. There had been no church approval. There had been no formal dissolution of anything. In the community where they lived, such things were handled by silence rather than by process, and the silence had held for 11 years. Eli had never spoken of her. The room had stayed the guest room. The quilt had stayed on the bed. When Eli had agreed to marry me, Ruth said, she had assumed he intended to explain. She had believed, she said she had believed, that he would tell me before the wedding, or on the wedding night, or in those first quiet weeks, that he would sit across from me The way a husband sits across from a wife and say, "There was someone before you, and the room is what it is because of her, and I have not known how to change it." He had not said any of those things. Ruth looked at the table. "I should have told you," she said. I stayed in Ruth's small house for nearly an hour. She answered what I asked. Martha was still living. Ruth believed she was in Ohio. The child had been a boy. He had been born in November, the same month Eli and I had married, which I suspected was not a coincidence in Eli's mind, though I did not say so. The quilt had been Martha's wedding gift to herself, made in the weeks before the ceremony. She had taken almost everything when she left, but she had left the quilt, and Ruth had never been able to explain why, whether it was an accident or an intention. I walked home along the fence line. I did not go inside immediately. I stood at the edge of the yard, where the grass met the gravel, and I looked at the upstairs window of the room where I had slept every night of my marriage. The curtain hung still. The glass reflected nothing but sky. I had been sleeping in a room that had been built, emotionally, for someone else's grief. Every night, Eli had closed a door that he had never opened, and I had been on the other side of it believing the closed door was about me, about something I lacked, something I had failed to give him, some inadequacy I could not locate, and therefore could not fix. The door was not about me at all. I went inside. I climbed the stairs. I went into the guest room, and I picked up the quilt, and I carried it downstairs, and out the back door and across the yard, to where a burn barrel stood at the edge of the garden. I did not burn it. I stood there with it in my arms for a long time. Then I brought it back inside, and laid it across the kitchen table, and sat down in front of it. I looked at the unfinished ring, the place where Martha's stitching had stopped, and someone else's had tried to continue it. I thought about a 19-year-old woman making this object in the weeks before a marriage she had not fully understood what she was entering. I thought about her lying in that room, sick and empty-armed, staring at this pattern she had made. I folded it carefully. I placed it on the chair beside the table. When Eli came in for the midday meal, I was sitting at the table waiting for him. I did not serve the food first. I let him stand there in the doorway. "I spoke to your mother this morning," I said. He looked at me. Then he looked at the quilt. Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that had been folded and refolded until it no longer knew its original shape. "I see," he said. "I need you to tell me," I said. "Not what your mother told me. I need to hear it from you." He sat down across from me. He looked at his hands. And then, for the first time in our marriage, Eli Brubaker said something that was true. He said he had not known how to begin. He said that every morning he had thought about telling me, and every morning the thought had been too heavy to carry to the table. He said the room had seemed, to him, like the honest thing, the only honest thing he could offer, which was a space that admitted it held something he had never worked through. He said he knew it was not right. He said he was sorry in the way of a man who had not said the word in a long time and had forgotten what it cost to mean it. I listened to all of it. I did not forgive him that afternoon. Forgiveness is not something I believe can be distributed efficiently across a kitchen table. But I heard him, and there is a difference. I will tell you what happened after. We did not immediately move into the same room. We talked, over weeks and then months, in the way that two people talk when they have agreed to finally use language for its actual purpose. I learned about Martha slowly, not all at once. About the grief that had settled into Eli like water into timber, changing his shape without his full awareness. About the way he had decided, at some unconscious level, that keeping the room separate was a kind of protection. For me, he told himself, from the sadness he carried. Though I understood that it had really been a protection for himself, from the risk of explaining. I wrote to Martha once. I am not certain what I expected. I suppose I wanted to know she was alive in the way that a person is actually alive. Not just surviving somewhere, but living. She wrote back 6 weeks later. A short letter, careful and polite, the handwriting exactly like the note in the quilt. She said she hoped I was well. She said she hoped the farm was in good repair. She did not ask about Eli. I read the letter twice, and then put it in the cedar chest, beside the certificate. Some things deserve to rest beside each other. Eli and I shared a room beginning in the second year of our marriage. It was not a dramatic event. One evening, he simply carried his pillow through the hallway and stood at the door of the guest room and asked if I wanted to move our things into the larger room at the front of the house. I said yes. We moved our things. We made the bed together. The quilt, I folded and placed in the cedar chest. Not because I was angry with it, because it belonged to a different story. One I had not lived but had been asked to carry, and had carried, for longer than was fair. I have thought many times about that interrupted ring, the stitch that stopped, the different hand that tried to finish it. I used to think of it as evidence of something broken. Now I think of it differently. I think sometimes a thing does not get finished because the person who started it had to leave before she could complete it. And the gap is not a flaw. It is just the honest record of where she had to set it down. I was the woman who came after. I slept in her room, under her quilt, beside her unfinished ring, for the first year of my marriage without understanding any of it. What happened when I slept in another room from my husband was this. I found a name I was never meant to find, a note that was never meant to survive, and a truth that had been folded so many times it had forgotten it was meant to be spoken aloud. The room was never meant for me, but in the end, it gave me something I do not think I would have found anywhere else. The knowledge that silence kept long enough does not disappear. It takes up space, it makes a bed, it waits. I still have the quilt. Some evenings I take it out of the chest and hold the corner where the stitching changes. And I think about Martha Byler in Ohio, and Eli who finally learned to say the word sorry, and my mother-in-law Ruth, who told the truth 11 years too late but told it. And I think about the girl I was at 17, standing at the foot of a strange, narrow bed in her wedding dress, running her thumb along an edge she had not yet learned to read. She was not foolish. She was simply new. She had not yet learned that in a quiet house, the most important things are rarely the ones being said. They are the ones someone worked very hard, for a very long time, to keep folded.